In the decades following World War II, aviation historians and enthusiasts lavished their attention upon the North American P-51 Mustang, transforming it into the definitive symbol of Allied air superiority. Yet beneath this carefully constructed mythology lay a different truth. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, not the celebrated Mustang, stood as the most extensively deployed American fighter of the war, and in countless respects, it proved to be the most formidable. As the conflict entered its final 18 months, nearly half of all United States Army fighters stationed in overseas theaters were Thunderbolts, a testament to the aircraft's indispensable role in the Allied victory. The story of air dominance over Western Europe belonged not to one aircraft but to two, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the extended-range Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Together, these machines wrested control of the skies from the Luftwaffe. In the vast expanse of the Pacific theater, the Thunderbolt emerged as the second most favored fighter, while its prowess in ground attack missions established an enduring legacy. The P-47 didn't merely participate in the war. It defined the very concept of the fighter bomber, a tactical philosophy that would shape American air power doctrine for generations to come. The Thunderbolt's genesis traced back to a 1940 competition seeking an American fighter capable of matching the German aircraft that dominated European skies. Republic Aircraft, operating from its Farmingdale, New York facility, entered the contest with determination born of turbulent corporate origins. The company had emerged from the remains of an aviation venture established by Russian-born designer Alexander Seversky in 1935. Seversky had pioneered the first modern American fighter with his P-35, followed by the P-43 Lancer, which the Army ultimately rejected. In 1939, corporate machinations forced Seversky from his own company while he traveled through Europe attempting to interest British officials in his designs. The new management rebranded the enterprise as Republic Aircraft, marking the beginning of a new chapter in American aviation. Republic's initial foray into fighter design centered on a compact, lightweight aircraft built around the Allison V-12 engine. Designer Alexander Kartveli, who had collaborated closely with Seversky on previous projects, assumed leadership of the development program. When Army officials expressed concerns about the strain on liquid-cooled engine production, Republic pivoted toward the air-cooled Pratt and Whitney double Wasp R2800 engine. This power plant generated over 2,000 horsepower, but consumed nearly double the fuel of the Allison, presenting both opportunities and challenges. Drawing inspiration from Seversky's earlier radial engine designs, Kartveli crafted an aircraft incorporating numerous features from the P-43. The substantially more powerful engine enabled Republic to dramatically increase the fighter's weight, creating the heaviest single-seat fighter yet constructed. Aircraft performance principles dictated that climb rate correlated directly with excess power available at any given airspeed. The XP-47's increased mass resulted in a climb rate slower than ideal for an interceptor. However, by the time Thunderbolts entered combat, the demand for interceptors had diminished, and the aircraft's substantial weight conferred other valuable characteristics, enhanced diving speed and remarkable resistance to battle damage. The Thunderbolt truly earned its reputation for ruggedness, a quality that transcended mere marketing hyperbole. The air-cooled engines demonstrated superior survivability in combat compared to liquid-cooled alternatives, as they contained no coolant systems vulnerable to catastrophic leaks from battle damage. This inherent resilience would save countless pilots' lives throughout the war. The 56th Pursuit Group became the first United States Army unit to operate the P-47, a convenient arrangement given its proximity to Republic's Farmingdale factory. One squadron operated directly at the factory airfield, while others trained at Bridgeport, Connecticut, and Bendix, New Jersey. Initially equipped with Bell P-39s and Curtiss P-40s, the 56th began receiving Thunderbolts during spring 1942. The deliveries coincided fortuitously with Captain Hubert Hub Zemke's assignment to the group following his return from an observer tour in Russia. Zemke and the P-47 would become inseparably linked in aviation history. More than a year elapsed after the Army Air Corps entered combat before the first Thunderbolts arrived overseas in early 1943. Until then, P-39s and P-40s bore the burden of combat against Axis forces in the Pacific, while P-38s, P-40s, and British Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes fought in Europe and North Africa. The initial American fighters dispatched to England were Lockheed P-38s, but the North African campaign absorbed them all, leaving only Spitfires to escort B-17 and B-24 bombers over occupied Europe. The agile Spitfire had distinguished itself as an exceptional fighter during the 1940 Battle of Britain, yet it lacked sufficient range to accompany bombers on extended raids, rendering it ineffective as an escort fighter. Without extended range fuel tanks, Spitfires could venture only a few miles east of the English Channel. Even with additional tanks, their operational radius remained severely limited. The veteran 56th, redesignated as a fighter group, arrived in England during early 1943, but remained grounded until April. VIII Fighter Command determined the aircraft required modifications, including additional armor, and the pilots needed combat training before engaging the enemy. When the 56th Fighter Group reached England, two other fighter groups had already established operations there. The 78th Fighter Group had deployed with P-38s, but lost both aircraft and most pilots to North Africa, forcing the remaining aviators to re-equip with Thunderbolts. The 4th Fighter Group underwent a similar transition. This unit comprised former American Eagle Squadron pilots who had volunteered to fly with the British Royal Air Force before America's entry into the war. These men harbored passionate affection for the Spitfire and developed an equally intense aversion to the Thunderbolt. Like their British counterparts in the RAF, these young Americans considered the Spitfire the finesse fighter ever built, a conviction stronger in sentiment than substance. The prospect of exchanging their nimble, maneuverable mounts for the world's heaviest fighter filled them with dismay. The 4th Fighter Group pilots began derisively calling their new aircraft 7-ton milk bottles, referencing the fuselage's distinctive shape. Contrary to some writers' claims, this wasn't the origin of the aircraft's nickname. Many pilots, believing they faced sacrifice, began calling the P-47 a juggernaut, which naturally shortened to simply Jug, a moniker that would endure throughout the war. The initial Thunderbolt missions consisted of advanced training flights over German-occupied territory, serving as theater orientation for pilots. Initially, German fighter pilots displayed little interest in Allied fighter formations, focusing exclusively on bombers. April 15, 1943, marked the P-47's first encounter with German fighters. Don Blakesley, a former Eagle Squadron pilot now flying with the 4th Fighter Group, managed to surprise a Focke-Wulf FW-190 during a dive and destroyed it. Diving represented the P-47's greatest asset. The substantial weight and massive, powerful engine enabled rapid acceleration. Nevertheless, Blakesley's assessment of the aircraft remained tepid. He reportedly remarked, "It ought to dive, it sure can't climb." The mission results favored the Germans. One Thunderbolt was shot down and two others succumbed to engine failure, a problem plaguing early P-47 operations. The Thunderbolt wasn't alone in suffering teething troubles. Both the P-38 and P-51 experienced high engine failure rates until engineers identified and rectified underlying problems. On May 4, 1943, Thunderbolts received their first escort mission assignment when 117 aircraft from all three groups escorted B-17s and B-24s attacking Antwerp and Paris. Fighter escort would constitute the Thunderbolt's primary mission throughout the remainder of 1943. Unfortunately, despite possessing substantially greater range than RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes, P-47s still couldn't penetrate deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe concentrated its fighter strength within German borders, waiting until Allied escorts reached their range limits before savaging the bombers. During summer 1943, B-17 losses mounted so severely that the 8th Air Force temporarily abandoned daylight deep penetration missions into Germany. The immediate solution lay in extending P-47 range, as they remained the only available fighters until P-38s could reach England. Range limitations stemmed from fuel capacity constraints, making increased fuel storage the obvious answer. External tanks, commonly called drop tanks because they could be jettisoned, offered the simplest means of extending operational range. Initial external tank development encountered significant problems. Resin-impregnated paper tanks leaked and couldn't transfer fuel at high altitudes due to lack of pressurization. Lieutenant Colonel Cass Huff, the officer overseeing VIII Fighter Command flight testing, developed a pressurization method using the aircraft's vacuum system. The first tanks held only 75 gallons, and availability posed serious problems. To address supply shortages, VIII Fighter Command adopted British-developed paper tanks holding 108 gallons, enabling Thunderbolts to penetrate 325 miles into occupied territory. This still proved insufficient for reaching Berlin. Another range extension solution involved equipping aircraft with partially filled, unpressurized 200-gallon external drop tanks and consuming their contents during the climb to altitude. This aerodynamically sound practice exploited slower climb speeds and reduced parasitic drag. The procedure enabled Thunderbolts to reach altitude without drop tanks, but with nearly full internal fuel tanks and clean wings, permitting higher speeds and increased range. This technique initially surprised German fighter pilots, resulting in several Thunderbolt victories, while the 4th, 56th, and 78th Fighter Groups engaged in European combat with P-47s. The 348th Fighter Group journeyed to the Southwest Pacific to join the renowned 5th Air Force. Unlike VIII Fighter Command, which saw limited combat in 1942, VIII Fighter Command pilots had battled the Japanese since early 1942. Some had even been stationed in the Philippines when war erupted, fighting since the conflict's inception. Upon the group's arrival, 5th Air Force Commander Lieutenant General George C. Kenney orchestrated a scheme to boost new arrivals' morale, while earning veteran pilots respect for the heavy Thunderbolt, particularly among P-38 pilots. He arranged a mock dogfight between 348th Commander Lieutenant Colonel Neil Kirby and Major Tommy Lynch, then the 5th Air Force's highest-scoring ace. The night before the contest, Kenney pulled Kirby aside, instructing him to avoid alcohol and retire early, knowing Lynch would do the opposite. The following morning, Kirby demonstrated the skill that would place him among the war's top-scoring fighter pilots. The P-47 pilots gained confidence, while P-38 pilots concluded the newcomers would prove assets rather than liabilities to the New Guinea campaign. Kirby and his pilots adopted tactics P-40 pilots had successfully employed against the Japanese, attacking in dives, then breaking away from enemy formations while refusing to engage the lightweight, highly maneuverable Japanese fighters in turning dogfights. Kirby taught his men to use dive inertia to zoom back to altitude for subsequent attacks. Similar techniques were simultaneously adopted in Europe. The extended overwater legs required for Pacific combat necessitated increased range, making drop tanks a high priority. Among all American combat units in World War II, the 5th Air Force stood as arguably the most innovative, possessing an engineering department at Brisbane that rivaled any in the theater. While 110-gallon tanks initially developed for P-39s and P-40s were available, VIII Fighter Command demanded greater capacity. The 5th Air Force Depot tackled the problem, developing a 200-gallon, low-profile tank that fulfilled requirements. Despite their limited range compared to P-38s, P-47s proved successful fighters in the Pacific. Thunderbolts replaced P-40s and P-39s in the veteran 35th and 49th Fighter Groups and in 1/8th Group Squadron. While some VIII Fighter Command pilots remained unenthusiastic about the Thunderbolt, others embraced it. Lieutenant Colonel Neil Kirby undoubtedly became the leading P-47 pilot in the theater and one of the war's top-scoring aces. Unfortunately, he contracted bong fever, a condition causing fighter pilots to become obsessed with matching or exceeding Major Bong's score. Bong had replaced Tommy Lynch atop the ace rankings following Lynch's death in action. Kirby drove himself relentlessly to destroy Japanese aircraft, as did numerous other American aces. While this competition undoubtedly resulted in countless Japanese aircraft destroyed, it also compelled young fighter pilots to take dangerous risks, costing many their lives. Kirby died when he was apparently shot down during a dogfight in May 1944 after leading his wingmen in an attack on a formation of Kawasaki Type 48 bombers. Kirby destroyed one bomber, while his wingmen each claimed another. Then aggressive Japanese fighters jumped them, shooting down Kirby. He was last observed hanging in his parachute, but was never heard from again. His aircraft wreckage was discovered in March 1946. In the Southwest Pacific area of operations, P-47s ranked second only to the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. While the P-38's superior range made it the preferred choice for bomber escort missions deep into Japanese territory, P-47 shouldered their share of responsibility by maintaining combat air patrols over Allied airfields and escorting transports and light and medium bombers on shorter-range missions. In New Guinea, the Army Air Forces began developing tactics for providing close air support to ground troops, and P-47s were quickly adapted to this role alongside air-to-air combat duties. The P-47 Thunderbolt's range limitations stemmed largely from operating procedures prevalent in the Army Air Corps. Pilots were trained to operate aircraft at high RPMs and high manifold pressure, warned that excessive mixture leaning could damage cylinders. While essentially accurate, most pilots failed to lean their mixtures as much as possible, thus consuming fuel at elevated rates. During summer 1944, renowned aviator Charles Lindbergh visited the Southwest Pacific on a fact-finding tour as a factory representative for United Aircraft, builder of the VIII F-4U Corsair fighter. Previously, Lindbergh had worked as an unpaid consultant with Ford Motor Company, becoming involved with the Thunderbolt, particularly in high-altitude flight research. Lindbergh became intimately familiar with the P-47 and was shocked upon arriving in the Pacific to discover Army pilots using techniques causing drastically high fuel consumption. After visiting General Kenny in Brisbane, Lindbergh ferried a P-47 back to the forward area. A base operations officer, himself an experienced P-47 pilot, refused to approve his flight plan calling for a non-stop flight from Brisbane to New Guinea. But Lindbergh knew precisely how much fuel he would consume and arrived with fuel to spare, a feat that amazed the young Army pilots. Soon, Lindbergh was teaching his fuel management techniques to P-38 and P-47 pilots, helping increase VIII Fighter Command's effective combat range. Lindbergh understood that reducing propeller RPMs while maintaining manifold pressure would decrease fuel consumption and considerably increase an aircraft's range. During early 1944, Thunderbolts began appearing in Chinese skies. The first P-47 group in the China-Burma-India theater was the 33rd Fighter Group, a historic unit that had commenced combat operations in North Africa flying P-40s before transferring to the Asian theater following the Sicily campaign. The 81st Fighter Group, which had also entered combat in North Africa with P-39s, joined the 33rd. Both groups transferred to the CBI as part of a deployment of several combat groups from the Mediterranean to India to support British Brigadier Ord Wingate's Chindit expedition into Burma. While the 33rd operated both P-47s and P-38s, the 81st flew exclusively Thunderbolts from its February arrival in India. The 80th Fighter Group began CBI combat operations with P-40s and P-38s, then equipped with Thunderbolts during spring 1944. The 33rd Group flew P-47s exclusively until November 1944, when it became an all P-38 outfit. The 1st Air Commando Group, a composite unit organized in India during early 1944, included 2 fighter squadrons that initially operated an older North American P-51 version before transitioning to P-47s later that year. Thunderbolts also served actively in the Central Pacific. Due to vast distances between land bases in the region, the first P-47s reaching the Marianas arrived aboard escort carriers Manila Bay and Natoma Bay. They belonged to the 318th Fighter Group, transferring to Micronesia from Hawaii, although the convoy, including both carriers, endured attacks by Japanese dive bombers. All 111 P-47s were delivered to a Slido airfield on Saipan, where they immediately engaged in action supporting ground forces that had invaded the island. Close air support of ground troops originated in the Southwest Pacific during summer 1942, when modified Douglas A-20 Havoc light bombers began strafing Japanese positions opposing Australian troops on the Kokoda Track in Papua New Guinea. General Kenny was so impressed with these tactics that he instructed fighter groups under his command to develop ground attack tactics as well. When American forces landed in North Africa during late 1942, 12th Air Force Commander Lieutenant General James H. Doolittle restricted light and medium bombers to medium-altitude attacks and assigned the close air support role to fighters as German air opposition declined. RAF pilots taught Americans the intricacies of close air support. The fighter bomber's success in the Southwest Pacific and North Africa led to ground attack tactics development within fighter commands of all numbered air forces, with one exception. Air Corps doctrine mandated that each numbered air force, equivalent to an army, be multifunctional with fighter, bomber, and troop carrier commands. The exception was the 8th Air Force, which had switched from multifunctional to single-purpose operations when most fighter groups and all troop carrier groups were sent to North Africa in 1942. Daylight precision bombing had become the 8th's mission, and VIII Fighter Command's role was ensuring bombers reached and returned from targets. With no Allied ground troops in occupied Europe, there was no one requiring close air support. VIII Fighter Command did, however, begin developing tactics for ground attacks against locomotives, airfields, and other targets. The first VIII Fighter Command strafing attack occurred accidentally when a damaged P-47 pilot was forced to low altitude over France and strafed a locomotive during his flight back to England. In early 1944, VIII Fighter Command fighters began descending to deck level to attack Luftwaffe airfields and other targets after completing escort missions. In March 1944, VIII Fighter Commander Brigadier General Bill Kepner authorized establishing a special P-47 squadron to develop strafing techniques. For 1 month, pilots from 4 groups experimented with low-level mock raids on their own airfields before carrying out operations in France. They would approach at high altitude, then dive to treetop level approximately 20 miles from their target, reaching strafing altitude about 5 miles out. On April 12, the special unit disbanded and pilots returned to their groups to teach squadron mates the new tactics. VIII Fighter Command began scheduling regular fighter sweeps. Following German defeat in North Africa and the invasions of Sicily and Italy, the Allies turned their attention toward invading Western Europe, where close air support of ground troops would become a major Army Air Forces mission. Invasion planning called for transferring the 9th Air Force from the Mediterranean to England to become a tactical air force, alongside creating a new 15th Air Force to control heavy bombers operating from Italy. The plan also included converting the 12th Air Force to the tactical role. By early 1944, P-47s were being produced at unprecedented rates, and many new fighter groups were equipping with them. Simultaneously, however, a redesigned North American P-51 Mustang fighter proved suitable for long-range escort missions, and P-47 units destined for the 8th Air Force began converting to P-51s before deploying overseas. Consequently, the Army Air Forces began assigning P-47 groups to the newly organized XIX Tactical Air Command of the 9th Air Force. Early 1944 witnessed a major European strategy shift as the 8th Air Force was placed under direct command of Supreme Allied Commander, United States Army General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower decreed that destroying the German Air Force was the Air Corps' main priority, a decision leading to tactical shifts by VIII Fighter Command from fighter escort to fighter sweeps, including ground attacks. Allied air commanders wisely realized that an enemy aircraft destroyed remained destroyed regardless of whether destruction occurred in air-to-air combat or during strafing or bombing attacks on fighter fields. This principle, which the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific had adopted in 1942, reflected General Kenny's pragmatic approach. Kenny's fighter pilots had been shooting down Japanese fighters and bombers at rates far exceeding their European counterparts. Kenny cared little whether his fighter pilots shot down enemy planes in the air or destroyed them on the ground. Finally, nearly 18 months after Kenny adopted this tactic, European air commanders were forced to follow suit. The P-47 would become the centerpiece for European ground attacks. While highly effective, the ground attack role proved hazardous for both plane and pilot, and many Thunderbolts were lost to German anti-aircraft fire. The 850 caliber guns in the Thunderbolt's wings were lethal enough, but the Air Corps developed new weapons to enhance the fighter bomber's destructive power. Hardpoints were installed to carry high explosive bombs or tubes for firing high-velocity aerial rockets, a United States Navy development adopted by the Army. Napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture, was used to firebomb enemy troop concentrations. Operating at deck level, fighter bombers, including P-38s and P-51s alongside P-47s, attacked enemy airfields, locomotives, and trucks. Fighter bombers operated in close support of ground forces, attacking enemy troop and tank columns and artillery positions. The fighter-bomber concept proved so destructive that in China, where every drop of fuel required air transport across the Himalayas from India, B-24s used in strategic roles were removed from combat operations and assigned to transport duty. The reasoning was that the fuel they consumed could be better utilized transporting fuel for fighter bombers. P-47 Thunderbolts served with many nations, including Brazil and Mexico. The British Royal Air Force operated Thunderbolts in Asia. Thunderbolts equipped 6 French Air Force fighter groups following the Vichy French defeat in North Africa. Although the Thunderbolts' accomplishments had been overshadowed in post-war media and press by the more glamorous Mustangs, the fighters known as Jugs performed admirably throughout World War II's final 3 years. If the term yeoman should be applied to any Allied fighter of World War II, the Thunderbolt aircraft richly deserves that title. Its story remains one of quiet competence, unwavering reliability, and devastating effectiveness in the face of history's tendency to celebrate flash over substance.